Good morning and welcome to this week's Senate and House Joint Republican Media Availability. I'm Kim Wirtz, Communications Director for the Senate Republicans. Today, I'm joined by Senate Republican Leader John Braun from the 20th Legislative District, Senate Republican Floor Leader Shelley Short from the 7th Legislative District, House Republican Leader J.T. Wilcox from the 2nd Legislative District, and Representative Drew Stokesbury, Ranking Member on the House Appropriations Committee from the 31st Legislative District. And with that, I'll turn it over to Senator Braun for opening remarks.
All right. Well, thank you, Kim, and thanks everyone for being here this morning. So second day of main floor action for the session. A lot of things going on. I thought I would just give a highlight on where we stand within the three top priorities for the Senate Republicans. When it comes to public safety, I think we're in decent shape in the Senate. The Blake bill, moved out to deal with the ruling from the Supreme Court 2 years ago, legalizing hard drugs. Moved out of Ways and Means in better shape than it entered Ways and Means. It's going to go to floor action, and I think we'll get some additional debate and hopefully some additional refinement to send over to the House for consideration. So that's one of two big items we're working on when it comes to public safety. The other is, of course, vehicular pursuits by law enforcement officials or officers. And two things happened. One, the study bill in the Senate died in Ways and Means, which I think is frankly a good outcome. Nobody who was thinking about this thought studying it for 2 more years was a good idea, and that bill had limited ability to amend it. And the good news is the real pursuit bill moved out of transportation in the House, which Representative Wilcox could talk about that. But I'm very hopeful that it will make its way across the floor of the House into the Senate, and we believe at this point there's a path to get it a hearing, and we'll see where it goes from there. So not exactly like we'd like the process to work, but the process is working to fix these two very important issues for public safety in our state. On the affordability, there's a lot of things going on. I would say broadly, there's a lot of bills moving forward to make it less affordable in one way or another to live in the state of Washington. And that's a long list where people are just taking, adding regulation. You know, the majority is adding additional regulation that costs a little bit more here and there, all adds up to more cost to families across the state. A little bit of what I think is positive news on housing. You know, when we think about affordability, we talk about food and gas and housing, childcare, healthcare, but housing, I think there's some good news. 2 bills alive that I think, while somewhat controversial, are probably net good. That is the middle housing bill, which adds some additional density in our more urban areas and protects property rights for folks to develop as they see fit. And those are good things. The transit bill, which frankly doesn't affect our districts all that much, but does allow for additional building in more urban areas, and that's a good thing as well. There's a nice permitting bill from Senator Mullet that's moving forward that incorporates aspects of the permitting bill from Senator Gildon. So those are good things. And then I don't know the details, but perhaps somebody from the House says, I think there's a SEPA bill moving forward in the House that maybe has some promise. So these are all things that help in little bits to make our housing regulation and environment better for building and therefore less expensive for our citizens. Those are positive things. And then on the flip side, we saw the rent control bill die in the Senate. That's a good thing. That bill would have just discouraged additional investment in our state to build out more housing. And we saw the Growth Management Act bill that tried to pull environmental justice into the Growth Management Act. This is all died in Ways and Means last week. So that's, I think, a good thing. That would have just added more complexity, time and expense to the permitting process and made housing more expensive, so that it's not moving forward is positive. So I think all things considered, there's things to be appreciative of for the housing market. The other thing I'd mention in affordability is healthcare. In this area, hospitals seem to be center stage for this session, and not such good news. I think every single bill that hurts hospitals moved forward in the Senate, from the mergers and acquisition bill that limits hospitals from emerging, and this is particularly harmful for some rural hospitals that are having a very hard time, and their best option might be to join a large network of hospitals. This bill will limit that. There's a contracting bill that limits the ability of hospitals to negotiate contracts. That's going to put one more bit of pressure on these organizations that are so pivotal in our communities. And then the nurse staffing bill moved forward, which frankly, in the way it moved forward is is about the least bad it could be, but it still moved forward, and that's going to put more pressure on hospitals. So that's not great, and I think that all accumulates to more pressure on hospitals and more expense for consumers. The last thing I'll mention is education, and I'd mention two things there. One, we had a tutoring bill in Ways and Means that didn't move forward, but it didn't move forward for a positive reason because after discussing it with budget writers, decided it had a better path as being incorporated in the budget. So I'm optimistic we'll have some real help and funding, an opportunity for school districts to increase their funding after school instruction to get kids back on track. And then the other positive news is the special education bill moved forward in the Senate. This would increase the cap on special education students up to 15%. And we were able to add an additional bit into it in Ways and Means that added advocates for our special education children as they work their way through their individual learning plans. I think that's an enormously powerful add. It's not all that costly, but it will give students that don't have, the same level of advocacy from their parents or other relatives, the same opportunity when it comes to working on their plan, their individual learning plan to move forward. So I think that's a positive thing. Sad thing on education is beyond that, there's very little discussion on education. There ought to be more. So I threw a lot of stuff out there, a lot of stuff going on. I'm going to stop now and turn it over to my friend and colleague, Representative Wilcox in the House.
Well, thank you very much, John. Over here in the Senate, and I'm going to leave the discussion of what made it through and what didn't make it through in appropriations to Drew Stokesbury. But over here, we've had, I've said a few times, so far a relatively congenial session. Not a lot of controversial things on the floor yesterday, but there are controversial things, and I'm sure that we're going to see robust debate. We haven't yet seen on the floor the housing bills, and I've been talking from day one about the fact that there's a lot of common ground, and I hope that we take advantage of every bit of agreement to move forward to make it easier and cheaper to build quality housing in Washington. And then if we have to have ideological debates, then let's save those for the end. Let's accomplish as much as we can first. And I'm hoping to begin to see these bills that are going to pass, I think, in many cases with large votes, but probably some of them will have an unusual coalition of a lot of Republicans and a lot of Democrats, and a few Republicans and Democrats opposed. So super interested in how that happens, and I think that there's a lot at stake for the state of Washington. There's another bill that has gone a little further than I hoped it would, and I think is a exceptionally bad bill. This is the Commission on Domestic Extremism. I think we could all agree on the concept that reasonable people need to stand up against extremism from every side. However, when you have seen a governor who pretends not to have heard of the terrible destruction and unrest in Seattle on one hand, and then on the other hand, seems to be totally comfortable demonizing reasonable, moderate Republicans, and has a chief of staff who thought it was fine to say that in a press conference that Representative Wilcox wants grandma to die, and even worse, when confronted, his staff doubles down on those things. You can imagine why we might not be comfortable with this concept. And I hope that this bill dies the death that it deserves. I agree with my Senate colleague when it comes to education. It deserves a lot more discussion. I think that Chris Reykdal has weighed in saying that they need more money. I don't doubt that there's many people that think that, but I think it's time to have a discussion about results and accountability now, after a couple of years when it seems like those concepts were lost for everybody. So we welcome a discussion of education, but it's going to be a little different than just about money. I'd like now to turn it over to my colleague. Go ahead, Drew.
Sorry, my mute button was blocked, but thank you, JT. Good to see everybody this morning. Last Friday was fiscal cutoff here in the legislature, so for almost all of last week, the House and Senate fiscal committees were meeting pretty much all day long. House Appropriations, it was 9 a.m. until very, very late. I don't know, 10 p.m. or something. Wednesday, Thursday, Friday last week. A significant number of bills came through. Nearly every bill that was heard ended up going through. So, you know, within that, there is a mix of a few good things and a number of bad things, and I think it is an indication of where the majority's priorities are going to go. Probably the most disappointing bill that did not make it through for me personally. I told the chair that it was the only time I was going to advocate for a bill who the prime sponsor, the second sponsor, and the third sponsor were all Democrats. And that was the bill to provide equitable funding to charter schools. It had a hearing, but it was one of the only bills in appropriations that had a hearing, but did not make it out of committee. Senator Braun, Representative Wilcox mentioned special ed funding. Pleased that the Appropriations Committee passed a bill in that area. It was a bit narrowed from from how it existed originally, and so look forward to sort of working with that when it comes to the floor. But by and large, I think kind of disappointed with where some of the priorities laid, and by consequence where some of the priorities were lacking. So for example, I mentioned the charter school bill did not make it out of committee. The special ed bill was narrowed significantly. There were not really any bills geared towards addressing the steep amount of learning loss that has occurred when schools were closed and went remote. I would like to hope that will appear in the budget, as it sounds like it might appear in the Senate budget, but that remains to be seen. And disappointingly, there was a bill to provide funding for low-income kids in dual credit classes in high school that was narrowed to essentially provide nothing except notification and some summer programs for kids, but not really actually cover their course fees. So at the same time, you know, while we were kind of missing doing some good there, the kinds of bills that didn't make it out of committee were paying higher wages to inmates at state correctional facilities, curtailing solitary confinement for some of the state's most dangerous offenders, implementing incorporating new components into the Growth Management Act. It's going to make building housing and government buildings a lot more expensive. So, you know, kind of disappointing that we had a chance to do a lot of good for kids that really need it, you know, but instead most of the bills that have come out that represent new policies are, you know, geared towards things like folks in the criminal justice system and things like that. So few good things, few disappointing things, and I think most importantly, disappointing to see where maybe some of the priorities are headed.
All right. Well, great. Thank you, Drew. We've talked a lot about what happened last week. I'd like to turn it over to Senator Shelley Short, our floor leader in the Senate Republicans, to talk about what's going to happen this week and what's coming up on the floor. Welcome, Shelley.
Thank you, Senator Braun. You know, there are going to be a number of bills that are going to be brought up. Look, there are a lot of bipartisan measures. I echo the good work that's being done in housing. Share concerns about some of the bills that may look like they're coming over from the House that would make housing more difficult to build. One of the specialties, the areas that I enjoy working on is land use policy. So certainly concerned about bills that are going to add complexity to an already complex system. Just enjoy my working relationship with the majority floor leader. Things are working well. But again, I'm going to be looking for those opportunities where in areas where we might not agree to make sure that the people of the state of Washington are seeing, multiple kinds of ideas and how we might address the bills that are coming forward. Certainly concerned about some I see on the floor calendar right now. Senate Bill 5217 is the ergonomics bill, would give tremendously broad-reaching authority to L&I, actually overturns a citizen initiative that was passed in the early 2000s. That's Initiative 841. Really, as those kinds of bills normally do, doesn't look at the good work that's already been done to reduce the injuries, the muscle injuries that we see, in our industrial businesses. And so that is obviously something we're going to be putting out multiple ideas on how, if you're going to do that policy going forward, ways that you could do it and ensure that it's targeted, not one size fits all, as we normally hear. Certainly concerned about impacts to small business and our small business employers. Another bill that's pretty concerning is the mandatory voting bill. Look, we all want to encourage folks to exercise their citizen right to vote. But making it a mandate certainly isn't the right idea and really goes against the Constitution and existing law, Supreme Court decisions. So it's going to be an interesting week. I'm sure there's more coming, and just stay tuned.
All right, Kim, back to you.
All right. So we will go with Elena Perry for the spokesman today. Go ahead, Elena.
Hi, good morning. I was just going to ask about learning loss, and I was wondering, do you feel that that has been fairly prioritized during the session, and why or why not?
I do not think. I've been very plain about this from the beginning of the session, that this is not getting the attention it deserved. It did not get the attention it deserved last year. Look, we made the choices we made during the pandemic, and even for those who disagreed with them, they're done now. We need to be focused on getting our kids back on track, and we're not doing nearly enough. To school districts for tutoring and additional instruction. As I said earlier, I think that will get included in the budget, and then there will be some help to school districts. But even with that, I don't think it's nearly enough. We're standing by and focused, I think, on many times the wrong issues while we let our children go unhelped from the challenges they had during the pandemic.
Yeah, and I would say there's, among all the failures that we've seen in terms of policy over the time that I've been in the legislature, including the housing failures, the biggest is started slowly before the pandemic, where we disassembled the whole construction of accountability for students and for teachers, for staff, for the management of schools. In my mind, that's a tragedy. And then during COVID, decided that all we had to do was pour more money into it, and that would somehow result in okay kids. I just feel like that has been a failure that's going to live with us for a generation. And now, instead of talking about accountability, having an honest discussion about the failures, an honest discussion about where this generation of kids are at and how do we get them back on track, all it is money now. A huge tragedy and something that all of us are going to suffer from.
I agree with both Senator Braun, Representative Wilcox. Really, really disappointed how little this seems to be prioritized in the legislature this session. I had a bill, House Bill 1328, that I think sounds pretty similar to the Senate bill that Senator Braun was describing, would have provided additional money to districts to address learning loss and set them up on a course to make sure they achieve their own test score goals. And if they fail to do so, that additional money that went to the districts would instead go to the parents, so the parents could decide how they wanted to best address their child's learning loss. And that bill didn't go anywhere. There's been other bills proposed by other House Republicans that haven't gone anywhere. It's possible they'll be addressed in the budget, but we'll see. It's pretty disappointing. And what is so frustrating is, when I got elected, it was in the middle of the McCleary lawsuit. Everybody in both parties could not stop talking about how the education was the state's paramount duty. And it seems like too many of my colleagues have lost sight of that, because this is not a new issue. About 2 or 3 years ago, first year after the pandemic, I gave the Republican response to the governor's State of the State. So this would have been January of 2021. And I asked, how are we going to stand idly by as we watch a generation of students be sentenced to delayed cognitive development and stunted social emotional growth. And 2 years have gone by, and there's been no meaningful progress, no meaningful attempt to ameliorate those huge losses that we suffered, and we knew we were going to suffer when those policy choices were made.
Well, and I'd like to just add the dramatic what we are seeing. Instead of dealing with the issues that have been talked about, the state legislature seems more interested in undercutting the role of our local school boards and really forcing all school districts to look equally alike. And what I mean by that is we have 295 individual school districts that their representation is the communities that these schools serve and are located within. And yet we continue to see policies that don't respect, the differences that these communities have, right? So they look at policy. Senator Patton made a comment on a bill on the floor that it sounds like this, the state is getting in the business of being, the state school board, instead of recognizing the roles that locals have. And I think what it does is it undermines support for our schools, which are centers of excellence in our communities and centers of support for our students. And we really don't need that kind of division, but yet we continue to see that kind of division playing out in Olympia.
Okay. And I will go to a question that comes from Claire Withicombe from the Seattle Times, who couldn't be with us this morning. And Claire asks, I wondered if members could comment on Senate Bill 5242, which would prohibit cost sharing, like copays, for abortions.
Well,
Go ahead.
I wasn't aware this bill existed. I don't believe it has come through appropriations. We see about a dozen of bills like this every year. Some pass, some don't. The challenge here, I don't think it's particularly related to abortion. The challenge is our highly complex healthcare system and what it means to have insurance. The point of insurance is to help you cover costs, but whether it's abortion or cancer or a cold and flu, our entire system of insurance is built around this concept of cost sharing. I can't speak for anybody but myself, but I don't see what would make abortion unique in the way that any other prescription drug or treatment or office visit wouldn't apply to. So I wouldn't expect that bill to have much support in our caucus, but that's because no matter what health issue is being covered, as good as it might feel to try to alleviate the cost burden on folks suffering that, the challenge is if you do that for everything, the entire system falls apart. It rests upon a stool that depends in part on insurance coverage, but also in part on cost sharing for those folks being covered, and that's applicable to abortion. Any other ailment.
I'd like to just add that it really is a cost shift, and a cost shift to people who may not want that to be a part of an insurance plan that they have. But look, if we're going to do that, then my colleague Senator Mazzal had a bill that increased those, saying if we're going to do it in that way, then we should do it for maternity. care and making sure that our moms are supported, equally well. In fact, I believe that was Senate Bill 5581 that did that. But the lion's share of what we're talking about, even under abortion care, it's what Planned Parenthood, targets and actually shares that they raise money to help women, access abortion services. So I kind of feel like it's a moot point, really, when it looks like if financially, there are roadblocks or there are challenges with a woman accessing those services, an organization like Planned Parenthood steps up, to fill that void. So I really think the bill itself is a non-issue.
Okay. And our final question will come from Joe O'Sullivan from Crosscut. Joe also could not make it in today, so I have his question. And it's got a little bit of a lead in. A joint investigation by Crosscut and McClatchy this morning found the legislature helped submit a brief on legislative privilege to the state Supreme Court back in 2006. The court ignored it. At the same time, legislators were passing laws in 2005 and 2007 that they later erroneously claim exempted themselves from the Public Records Act, per the state Supreme Court ruling that lawmakers must disclose their communications like local and other state government agencies. What do the Republican legislative leaders know about these attempts in 2005, 2006, and 2007 to evade the Public Records Act? Was it a coordinated push using both legislation and court briefs? And why hasn't the public been told of this 2006 amicus brief on legislative privilege that the court ignored?
Well, if we have anybody here that was part of leadership in 2005 to 2008, I bet you they'd be happy to answer. Republicans, I think, have been very open about all of these things, but I don't know that we have anybody that was part of leadership 17 years ago.
We do not. In fact, I think we only have one member in our caucus that was a member of the caucus in the time periods asked about. What I can tell is amicus briefs are fairly routinely submitted for a whole variety of reasons, and they're used or unused for a whole variety of reasons. In this case, the court decision was made as they're normally made on kind of the first place they can make the decision. So they never got around to considering the idea of legislative privilege. I don't think that's good or bad. It's certainly not a conspiracy. I mean, we live in a world where folks are unfortunately too inclined to assume conspiracy in when there is none. I think folks, I'm just guessing here because I wasn't here, were just acting according to the principles they saw in place at the time, and the courts made the decision based on what they had in front of them in their standard way. And to draw some, long conspiracy theory out of that is probably the wrong direction.
Yeah, I came here 10 years after the events in question, so I can't really speak to any legislators' motivations at the time. But to answer a couple parts of that question, what John said is very much true. Amicus briefs are commonly submitted in Supreme Court cases, and frankly, they rarely find their way into the opinion of the case. I think in my private life, I'm an attorney. I probably submitted about a half a dozen amicus briefs to the state Supreme Court and the U.S. Supreme Court, and I think one of those 6 has ever been quoted in any opinion. That's not unusual. The idea that the legislature would need to publicly disclose the existence of a document that is publicly available. I just found it in about 12 seconds through Google. That's 15 years old and publicly available. That seems a little strange that the legislature would have some ongoing obligation to just constantly remind folks about the existence of publicly available records from 15 years ago. And never mind the fact that the legislature didn't even write this one. It was written by NCSL, not Washington State legislature. So, and then I guess my last point is just reiterating what John said. When courts take up these issues, they almost always attempt to resolve issues on the narrowest grounds possible. If there's a way to resolve a statutory conflict without resorting to a constitutional interpretation, they'll do so. If there's a way to get rid of the entire case by answering one small procedural question, they'll do so. So the idea that interested parties like NCSL might have an issue that is tangential to a case that turns out can be disposed of without reaching that tangential issue it's not news. That just is how our court system works every day, every week, every month, every year.
And that was our last question. So I will turn it back over to Senator Braun for closing remarks, since our members have to get to caucus and other meetings this morning.
Thanks, Kim, and I'll be brief because I'm already late. But thanks everyone for attending. Appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. We will continue to focus on what we're hearing from our constituents as the most important issues: public safety, affordability, and education. These are the things that matter most to the citizens around the state of Washington, and those are the things that will get our most attention. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us, everyone.